Let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the very first Tectonic webinar. I'm your host, Mo Islam, CEO of Archaea Media Group, the parent brand behind Tectonic. Tectonic is our news brand that covers all things defense tech. We publish 5 days a week, and you can check us out at www.tectonicdefense.com. I'm thrilled to be hosting today's conversation on due diligence and national security. We have a really great conversation lined up and a very timely one. With everything going on geopolitically, the way we think about supply chains, ownership, and risk is fundamentally changing. It's no longer about efficiency or compliance, it's about resilience, and in many cases, it's about national security. Today's session is presented by our friends at Sayari, a leading provider of commercial risk intelligence that enables greater visibility into global corporate and trade networks. Their work empowers organizations, both in government and the private sector, to map risk, flag exposure, and make better informed decisions about the counterparties they rely on. We're fortunate to be joined by two leaders who bring deep perspective on today's topic. Jim Smith, former acquisition executive at U.S. Special Operations Command, and David Lynch, SVP at Sayari. But before we get started on the discussion, Jim, David, why don't you guys start with just brief introductions from both of you guys?
Yeah. Hey, thanks, Mo. Hey, first, just thanks for everyone who's dialing in so far. I think this really is a timely topic and very important. And I will say it's a pleasure to be on the same panel with David Lynch. I've heard David present a few times, and he is truly an expert on the risks and the strategies to mitigate those risks that we're seeing out there in the world today. As Mo said, I'm the former acquisition executive for Special Operations Command. That was about 2 years ago. I spent about 15 years total at Special Operations Command in various senior leaders positions, from the program executive officer for Soft Warrior to the military deputy to the deputy, and then as the acquisition executive itself. 5 years as the acquisition executive. Prior to that, I was 27 years in the Army. And I started my life as an infantry officer in the Army. But then about halfway through that 27-year career, I started acquisition. Spent most of my time in PEO soldier in the DC area at Fort Belvoir, a few assignments in the Pentagon, back to Fort Belvoir for a while before I got to MacDill Air Force Base and started my relationship with Special Operations Command. Really important topic to me. This is a topic that I started to get really interested in specifically as the acquisition executive at Special Operations Command. So my comments will mainly be, with that perspective. But I hope the folks that are dialing in today will also understand that I'll give you a broader DoD perspective as well, to the extent that I can, and I'll caveat when I think I'm, speaking outside of my lane and it's just opinion versus something I know well. But thanks, Mo. Happy to be here.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. My name is Dave Lynch. And yeah, firstly, Mo, thanks for hosting this and bringing us together. And likewise, Jim, the pleasure's all mine. Really excited to be on this panel with you. So I've been with Sayari for just shy of 8 years, and I lead our solutions team. So I work really closely with all parts of government, from law enforcement, DoD, IC, and regulatory, to help them with really challenging problems like supply chain risk management, vendor threat management, threat finance. And really, I'm coming at this conversation from the approach of how can we use public data, right, out there in the wild, but maybe hard to access, but how can we use that data to better tackle some of these really thorny issues, such as the one that we're talking about today. With that, back to you, Mo.
Thank you. So why don't we get started just at a high level, just talking about diligence in this new geopolitical era. And then Jim, maybe I'll just kind of start with you here. From your perspective, how have national security threats from China, Russia, and others reshaped the standards and expectations around due diligence today?
Yeah, thanks, Mo. This is a great scene setter, because I think if you think about the way the Department of Defense has thought about supply chain risk, and we'll talk more about vendor threat mitigation, but I think it's fair to say that we were a little asleep at the wheel for several decades, specifically during our time, when we were mainly a counterterrorism focused Department of Defense. I would say prior to the 2018 National Defense Strategy. We weren't thinking about entities like ISIS or other terrorist organizations doing anything to our supply chain. They didn't have the wherewithal to do it, and we weren't worried about it. Um, I think the mistake we made was that certainly our near peer competitors were doing that during that time period. And it wasn't until the 2018 National Defense Strategy that when we identified China as the pacing threat and Russia as an acute threat, and Iran and North Korea, et cetera, that we began to realize that our supply chain risks were far greater than probably we appreciated, and we really needed to apply some resources to it. So, again, I think it's not that this is a new problem. I think it's an age old problem. I'm reading a book on the Revolutionary War right now, and there's certainly supply chain risks and malactors in those supply chains that had influence. But it's one that certainly I think we now have um, the uh, the cognizance of and the responsibility to address, giving what we know to be the reality of the situation on the ground today.
Was there any, Jim, just a quick follow-up there. Was there anything over the last kind of few years that catalyzed some of this, So I know, yeah, maybe tell, was there any kind of, was there a single moment in your perspective, if you could boil it down?
Yeah, again, I think this is a slow burn. I don't think there's a single moment. I think there's some great historical examples, some within the last few years. I think most of the folks on the phone here can probably relate to the DJI drone. It's a wonderful, capable drone. It's very cheap, um, but it's from China, and the risks of our Department of Defense using that drone are real. And so that's one of the ones that I think in the recent past that really brought this to the forefront. Um, but to be fair, I think this is all based on much better intelligence and real indicators that our supply chains were not as risk free as they needed to be.
Or more recently, cell phones blowing up.
Well, I was going to get to that one as well, but yes, absolutely.
So, okay, so maybe question for you both is due diligence now, from your perspective, a national security function, or and not just like a legal and compliance task?
I can start with that one and I'll pass it to you later, Jim. But I mean, I think the answer is absolutely. The line between national security and legal and compliance has basically been erased. I mean, if there's a key input in any kind of defense system, and it's sourced from a company that's secretly controlled by an adversary, that's a national security failure, not a compliance footnote. Right. So I think it's important for us. I think this will stand throughout the entire conversation today. But what might have been thought as a box checking exercise a decade ago is now sort of, from my perspective, and I'm sure from Jim's as well, near the top of the list in terms of like how we approach our national security.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think the caveat I would add to that is there's always this aspect of how much are you actually in conflict at the time. So certainly, again, going back through history, you can go through before the United States of America, you go way back and say securing your supply chains has always been critical to defense during wartime. Um, and so I don't think there's that much there's nothing new under the sun. What's changed everything in my mind is that maybe 15, 20 years ago, we were on a much different path, as everyone will remember. We were on this path where it was global supply chains. It was just in time. It was going to be open markets and free trade. And China was a really important trading partner. And because it was relative peace and our expectation was relative peace. And I think the difference now is, now that we're in 2025 and the realization is no, we don't have all you know folks that are interested in being fully members of the World Trade Committee. That we realize that risk never went away. It's there every bit as much, and we are in a period of what the Department of Defense calls integrated deterrence. That we're not in a period of peace right now, and therefore our supply chains are deserve as much scrutiny as they would as if we were in a wartime footing.
David, what are the most misunderstood aspects of foreign ownership and influence risk?
Unfortunately, there's not just one. I'll start with that it's not just about direct ownership. I think it's relatively easy to understand maybe who is the sort of direct owner of any given company, supplier, or vendor. But the challenge that we face is that the most significant risks are oftentimes obscured or hidden by these complex or multi-layered corporate structures. And this is not an accident. Countries like China, Russia, Iran, they intentionally use shell companies, nominee shareholders, and jurisdictions that are known for kind of being secrecy jurisdictions to hide their ownership or influence. And for us to really understand this threat, it requires so much more than just understanding that single hop ownership or that single tier ownership. And then the other thing that I would stress here is that it's not just about ownership. Sometimes influence can be even more dangerous. The problem, though, is that influence can be even more difficult to detect. We might not just be dealing with majority shareholding structures. I think we see this a lot in China with some of their golden share ownership structures, where a minority ownership stake, a simple board seat, or some kind of director or manager position on a company can actually exert quite a bit of influence on the kind of day-to-day or business decisions of that company. And so I think it's important that, like, as you're looking at your due diligence framework, you need to take a step beyond just screening for simple ownership percentages, and it requires a very nuanced understanding of control and influence relationships. And that's in part why, I mean, my last comment here would be that it's so much more than just sanctions. There's a handful of sanctions lists, published by the Treasury Department, Commerce, the Department of Defense, and that's a great starting point. But it can also give a false sense of security that if I'm doing business with someone that's not on that list, then I'm good to go, or my supply chain or my business operations are safe. And looking beyond the list, looking at influence structures, things like state-owned enterprises or military civil fusion entities, it's important to kind of wrap your arms around these, which again is they don't live in a list. And so kind of taking a non-list based approach to due diligence is absolutely critical to really understanding this risk.
Yeah, and I'll actually just personally make one point on the foreign ownership piece, and not try to get us down a rabbit hole, but basically, like, I've seen companies and founders seriously consider capital from foreign entities, which are very, very questionable when you actually look at a high level, like who these entities are, who they're owned by, and what their kind of end goal is. But do so, and at times out of desperation, because there's no other capital out there from any other source. So they're like, well, my choice is either don't take this capital and don't function, or I'll take this capital and deal with the problem later. So I've seen that happen, in the US and a lot of companies, and it's troubling when you see it. And there's not an easy solution, but certainly it's something to look into as you kind of work with these businesses as partners. So did you want to say anything on that, Dave?
Well, no, I was just, whether I think the lessons learned when you're looking at supply chain versus like who your vendor is versus who you're receiving money from, I think there's tons of parallels across all three. And it's really about kind of looking beyond that immediate relationship to that networked risk to really understand, who it is you're getting money from, or who it is that's actually supplying that critical microchip in your defense system. So lots of commonalities across the three.
Right. Okay, let's talk a little bit about now supply, kind of moving from this kind of supply chain efficiency to resiliency. And I do just want to quickly point out, I know there's some questions that are coming in for folks on the call. You're welcome to use the Q&A chat box, which is right on the bottom of your screen to type in any questions. And then towards the end of the session, we'll address audience questions. Okay, so question for you guys both. What are the real costs, right? Economic, political, operational, of shifting towards supply chain resilience?
Yeah, I'd like to start on this one, David, if it's okay. It's all about return on investment, right? It's going to take an investment in, as David just pointed out, understanding your supply chain layers deep, understanding where the money's coming from, understanding where the influence is coming from, and so the investment, is quantifiable. The return is less quantifiable because the return's kind of this null set of, if we do this right, our war fighters, from my perspective, get the equipment they need in a reliable, fashion. It works when it needs to work, and it works exactly as the way it's supposed to work, and there's no disruption in that. When you disrupt that, are there economic uh, implications? To me, it comes down, as an acquisition person with my background, it comes down to cost, schedule, and performance. Right? There's going to be a cost impact to doing this right. There's going to be a schedule impact. We might have to, delay in order to ensure we've got resilient supply chains. That DGI example comes up again, right? Again, famously, affordable, high quality drones that we were not going to give to our operators. There was a real impact there. I can remember a time, and part of this is to go into details on this, we would go into past the classification level of this conversation, but we had to constrain the rate at which our operators were firing munitions because of supply chain concerns. So there's this numerator on the return on investment aspect of this. It's hard to quantify, but when it goes bad, it's a negative number.
And who should bear the costs? Is it government or is it the vendor base?
Yeah, to me, that's a great question. And I think it's a very salient question. There's a DoD 3000.16, I think, that came out in July of 22. And it puts the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment as the lead agency in the DoD for this. But it doesn't provide resources. It just says policy, direction, oversight, etc. As a former acquisition officer, no one ever gave me dollars to execute supply chain risk management on the government side. Not to say that we weren't doing it. It's not to say that we weren't providing dollars to do it, but it's certainly considered overhead, right? No one, especially an organization as lean as Special Operations Command, you don't want to expend dollars on directly on this kind of thing because it's just viewed as overhead. It's viewed as competing with body armor and night vision and weapons, etc. On the flip side, from an industry perspective, I could say, again, as an acquisition officer, hey, I'm on contract with you to provide a high quality product on the schedule you said you'd give it to me, with the performance aspects that you said you were going to give it to me. And that implies that the vendor's got a certain amount of risk to, as David said, know their supply chain, know where their things are coming from, know where the risks are, take steps to mitigate that risk. So, this probably will blow up the Q&A box, but in my opinion, this is mainly a vendor responsibility. The DoD should know to ask for it. The DoD should be willing to pay for it. It should be a differentiator in contract awards. Hey, my solution has well thought through supply chain and risk mitigation strategies versus some vendor that doesn't have it. And I'll just say real quickly, and I'll bring this up a few times probably. The latest trend in acquisition is commercial, right? We're cutting back on the DoD research and development dollars for basic research because our commercial industry base is far better at developing capability than the DoD is. I do not argue with that. I do have concerns that as we make this pendulum swing towards commercial, most of the commercial applications, for their commercial application, they don't really care as much about vendor threat mitigation. But Mo, to go back to your pager example, Talk about a commercial application that Hezbollah probably thought they were buying commercial pagers without any supply chain risk, and found out, much to their chagrin, that there really were operational risks to those pagers that they should have been more concerned about. So again, who should bear the risk? And I can talk a lot about this. I lean towards the vendor with government oversight and government giving credit to the vendor for doing a good job on it. I am concerned that a lot of our commercial partners out there, our non-traditional DoD industry partners, may not be leaning into this as hard as they should be.
Yeah, and I mean, Jim's point is a critical one. Private sector can't afford to wait on this. I know we are in a somewhat ambiguous sort of regulatory or sorry, requirements environment, but the cost of resilience looks so much different when you compare it to the cost of a factory shutdown, a shipment being seized, catastrophic IP theft, or in the case of Jim's pager example, like what then must be the sort of entire uprooting of a supply chain to recreate an entirely brand new supply chain. I think the way that I think about this is, as a company, you pay for it one way or the other. You can either invest proactively in resilience, or you can pay the exorbitant costs of disruption. Now, that disruption could take many forms, right? It could be sort of emergency resourcing, or reputational damage, or again the entire shutdown of a supply chain. But I think if you think about it this way, the cost of this is in a lot of ways an insurance policy against a much larger and often inevitable future cost. And I think I'll also tack on to Jim's point of we're seeing kind of an increasing trend to buy commercial. Well, I think if commercial entities proactively invest in kind of resilient domestic and allied supply chains, you're actually creating sort of strategic advantage for your own company. The long-term cost of not having that can erode your industrial base, and by being proactive, you can actually make yourself a much more attractive vendor or client to the government.
Jim, I know we talked about the pager example. Let's bring it back home for a second. Can you give an example of a failure deep in the supply chain that actually put operational forces at risk? I don't know how much of that you can talk about, but
yeah, I'll speak about it in generalities. There was an example, and this is back when we were still firing a lot of precision munitions. In the Central Command area of responsibility. And we literally had to tell our operators, your constrained rate of fire has to be X, because we cannot resupply those precision munitions quick enough in order to ensure a resilient supply chain. That is someplace that the United States should never be. Right? We should never tell our U.S. forces, hey, folks, your mission today is impacted because we can't get you enough of the lethal capability that you require to be successful. The other example, though, is that this DJI, because I think a lot of people know this. We had to say no to DJI or any drone that wasn't manufactured in the United States. And at the time we made this statement, the drone manufacturing's industrial base in the U.S. was paltry. We had allowed the Chinese to lap us, and we really didn't have much aspect. For any of our operators to use a non-U.S. drone in operations required two signatures: the acquisition executive signature and the chief information officer signature. Now at SOCOM, that was easy because that was myself and my peer who sat a few seats away as the chief information officer. But you can imagine how brutal a process that would be, how bureaucratic a process that would be in the services. And we would get almost probably weekly a request from the very pointy end of our force, the very lethal end of our force, that would say, hey, I need to use this drone. It's not US manufactured, but I'm going to use it in this electronic magnetic environment. I'm going to use it for this mission. At the end of this mission, I'm going to dispose of it. Here's what I assess are the risks. Here's how I'm mitigating those risks. And we would almost 100% of the time approve those because our special operations forces are very, very competent and they do their due diligence. But again, you can imagine to Mo, to your question, our inability as a U.S. industrial base to provide our forces with the unmanned aerial systems that they needed to be successful, I consider to be a supply chain risk. We allowed another country to dominate that supply chain, and we hadn't resourced our own domestic supply chain to the extent that we needed to.
How well? Quick follow up there. How well do you think that the DoD has adopted or adapted, I should say, acquisition processes to account for the risk?
Yeah, I don't think. Actually, I give us pretty poor grades on that. I think it's an evolving process. I am really worried, and I know David wants to jump in on this, so I'll keep this short because I could go on for the rest of our time for sure on this one topic alone. But it concerns me that we've decentralized our approach to supply chain risk. It concerns me that we've simply put out a policy and said, everyone do your own. And that implies that the Air Force could be doing supply chain risk in a different way than the Army is. It implies that the information that the Air Force is getting on supply chain for certain vendors is staying within the Air Force and not being shared throughout the rest of the DoD. My personal opinion is we should have a centralized approach to supply chain management that allows for easy sharing among the services, the same way we would hope that intelligence is being shared among the services. I would hope that we'd have the same level of intelligence on our own supply chains.
And that's super critical because certainly when you look deeper into these supply chains, you see a ton of overlap in these upstream suppliers 2, 3, 4 tiers away. There was an example. We were working with a customer just weeks ago where they were looking at their sort of microelectronics supply chains. Now, this agency had several contracts with primes, but it turns out that these microelectronics obviously weren't made in-house fully by these primes, right? They bought these chips from a broker. Those brokers got it from a supplier, and those suppliers sourced it from unregulated markets in China. Now, that chip could expose to the government to a backdoor, or it could just simply be a cheap product that fails under stress. Either way, by the time that vulnerability hits the battlefield, it's too late. And I think what Jim's point's important is if these processes are siloed, you might have an office in the Air Force that finds this risk, and that risk is several layers deep on this sort of tier 2 supplier, tier 3 supplier. Well, there's a pretty good chance that other parts of the US government are relying on that exact same upstream supplier, and that risk isn't localized. It permeates across the entire supply chain. And I think this kind of siloing can lead to some pretty catastrophic effects where, again, entire branches of the DoD or entire agencies would miss that finding that another agency had found for them.
So in thinking about sort of full resiliency and the practicality of getting there is and Dave, to direct this one to you, is starting with vendor threat mitigation a more realistic entry point for institutions?
I think the answer is yes. It's kind of a start where you are approach. To be clear, mapping your entire multi-tier supply chain is not an easy task. And these are complex. And starting with the vendors you have a direct relationship, right? Your tier 1 suppliers is a much more manageable and frankly logical first step. Now, we obviously shouldn't stop at a first step, but approaching first with vendor threat mitigation allows you to, frankly, build the infrastructure that you need anyways to scale to get that visibility for sort of that multi-tier beyond tier 1 supply chain. And, in a lot of ways, vendor risk is the most immediate risk. It can represent your most immediate point of vulnerability. That's not to dismiss sort of tier 2 and beyond risk. I think we'll spend a lot of time getting into that. But again, it just start with where you are, and assessing that individual direct tier 1 supplier for all kinds of foci risk can give you a pretty good sense, at least directionally, where you should then focus on multi-tier upstream supply chain further deep dive analysis.
Well, actually, let's talk a little bit more about that, about prioritization. Like, how do you prioritize which vendors or tiers to scrutinize, like from your perspective?
I think start with criticality. Not all suppliers are created equal. Not all risk is created equal. I think the latest DoD framework identifies 95 some sub-risk categories that we need to screen for in the supply chain. And of course, they're all important. We have to look at all of them. But certain ones around ownership to sanctioned entities, foreign influence from adversarial countries, potentially carry a little bit more weight than other forms of risk. And then I think using, again, these supply chains are massive, right? I don't think anyone on this call is dealing with a situation where they've got to look at 5 vendors and then call it a day and move on. You're looking at hundreds or thousands. And filtering by criticality allows you to at least focus on the ones that present the most immediate or dire risk to your company or to your agency. And then I think further filtering that by technologies and material inputs. You're seeing a lot of news about just this, what appears to be on a daily basis around sort of rare earth supply chains or like critical microelectronic supply chains. Potentially something like that might merit further scrutiny than something that kind of falls out those categories.
What's preventing organizations from acting on the data they have?
It's a good question. I mean, I think part of it is around just simply how much data there is. We'll probably spend a little bit of time on this throughout, but I don't view this as a data accessibility challenge. The data's there. The real challenge is about knowing how to stitch all this data together. How do you combine sort of proprietary internal data feeds that you have on your own supply chain with external data feeds that provide fidelity or visibility on ownership, influence, and trade activity. So I think the biggest challenge that a lot of the folks that we talk to experience is really a matter of like how to stitch together this data to really understand the true nature of the risk. Because if you don't understand the nature of the risk, it then becomes really difficult to prioritize and focus on the most urgent risk you're facing.
So it sounds like you're really saying there's like not a data issue, a tooling issue. So what are some of the limitations of today's tooling, especially when it comes to more dynamic trade activity?
Let's see. I'd say there's maybe 3 things that come to mind. So I'll double click on my earlier point of connecting different types of data. The two types that we most often deal with are corporate data and trade data. These are inherently very different types of data with different data inputs and different data structure. And if you can't connect those at scale, then you have a problem. Because again, the risk that we face is not limited to just ownership or just trade, it's both. And even more items. And if you can't combine them, then you're blind. I think the other problem that we have is a lack of global coverage. Out the gate, Jim was sort of talking about the shifting nature of the threats that we face from Russia and China compared to maybe the priority challenges we were dealing with a decade and a half ago or 2 decades ago. What I would add to that is the challenges are so much more global than they were 2 decades ago. That's not to say that like things weren't global back then, but simply the scope and scale of the problems are in every single jurisdiction. And so you might have really good visibility in, a dozen jurisdictions in North and South America. But if you have limited visibility in jurisdictions in Southeast Asia or East Asia, well, you're basically back to square one. Because these supply chains are integrated, like lacking visibility in one part of your supply chain really translate to lack of visibility in your entire supply chain. And then the third thing I would add is not to get too wonky on this call, but it's back to a data thing around data structure and data cleanliness. Right? We've hit several points several times now how global this challenge is. And when things are global, you encounter several kind of knock-on problems. One, you've got data siloing issues, you've got different data structures, and you have different languages in which this data is even disclosed. I have a hard enough time with one language, but our supply chains are crossing dozens of jurisdictions with just as many languages. And if you can't connect these dots across disparate data sources and different data structures and in different languages, again, it's back to my previous point of you're kind of back to square one of, blindness in one part of your supply chain results in blindness in most of your supply chain.
So in the interest of time, I want to shift gears to a different topic. And Jim, you've been waiting very patiently, and I'm going to give you one that I know you have strong opinions about. So let's talk about self-policing versus government oversight. Jim, do you think the industry should be required to self-report and monitor its supply chain, or should the government take the lead in surveillance?
Yeah, no, thanks, Mo. And listen, I was enjoying listening to David. I'm good. I'm a happy camper. Listen, I think it's a combination thereof. I think the short answer is that that industry should self-report, and government should be willing to pay for that. Those are the two things. I David was talking about the level of complexity that goes into today's supply chains. I'm just going to tell you my assessment. Take it for what it's worth. Nobody in the government today wakes up with it's my job today to monitor a dynamic supply chain. It's a problem, but it's a fact. We're just not manned or trained in the government workforce to say my job is to get on and ask 15 level questions to figure out how the supply chain on this product is working. We did some experimentation with some supply chain tools when I was still in government. They were static tools, very nice delivery of a bound volume that laid out your supply chain risk, and it was a very pretty presentation. And when you looked at it, you said, "Wow, this is great." And then you started thinking, "But this was compiled how many weeks ago, and how relevant is it to the actual supply chain risk that exists today?" So you want a dynamic tool to be able to look at supply chain risks. I think industry's got to be able to do that, and to invest in the people that actually understand those things, because their responsibility is to deliver a resilient product to the government. I also think that they should use that as a selling point, that hey, we understand our supply chain better than our competitors do. And I think finally is they should be willing to share that with the government as government purpose data, so that the government then can share that data across the rest of the DoD, as I stated before, and the intelligence community. I'll just last point on this is the last time I had a conversation on this topic, I was sitting with a member from the CIA, and so the intelligence community, I think, has done a better job with understanding their supply chain risks over the decades than maybe the DoD has. And there's something you learn there. But we were completely simpatico. We were in complete agreement on the risks that existed, and the responsibility of all of us to ensure that, especially those operators that are out there at the pointy edge, that don't have a robust supply chain. They're relying completely on the equipment they've got on hand to be successful in their mission. We've got to make sure that we get them equipment that we're confident in all respects.
Do you think an incentive model works better or one that's mandated?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the incentive model, I'm a big fan of incentives. I think the incentive is that when the government, and I'm going to borrow David's phrase, I don't want to get too wonky here, but when the government releases contracts and they do a best value trade off, I would like to see, and I was moving this direction with Special Operations Command while I was still there, that one of the trade offs that we're going to award a contract to would be how well do you understand your supply chain, and how well are you mitigating risk to your supply chain. Um, I like that model. I think in combination with a CMMC model, and I know that's okay. There, that's a four-letter word in every sense of the definition with industry right now, and I understand that. But I think the government's effort to define what, in this case, cybersecurity looks like, and then define that for industry and allow the industry to report back on here's how resilient we think we are for cybersecurity, and then the government in hand valuing that high rating and then therefore awarding contracts to those vendors. I think the same kind of model works for supply chain. The government's got some responsibility to define it. David mentioned the parameters that the government's currently got out there, pretty complicated. But then the government has a responsibility on also to award to companies that show proficiency with supply chain.
So does that look like a national security certification or some type of standard?
Yeah, I think, and again, CMMC, I think, has been on the verge of rolling out for 4 or 5 years now for that very question. Is this a guideline? Is it a thou shalt? Is it a go, no go? I think that, my personal opinion on that is I'd much rather see this to be a partnership with industry. David just said it. The world is changing rapidly under our feet. The supply chain risks are changing rapidly under our feet. I think there's room to be patient, and I think there's room to evolve. And I'd prefer, not to give you a wishy-washy answer, Mo, but as opposed to a draconian "thou shalt," I would prefer a much more partnered approach to improving on how we do supply chain resiliency.
Dave, I'm going to ask you one last question, then we're going to turn it over. We have some Q&A. Are there any examples of companies that are doing this proactively and doing this very well?
Absolutely. Now, unfortunately, I think a lot of this came about roughly 5 years ago, not necessarily from a regulatory driver or even a reputation driver, but from sort of a catastrophic breakdown of supply chain with COVID. And I think some lessons learned there, like we're seeing kind of spread across different industries. I'll say in particular, sort of pharmaceutical and medical device companies post-COVID had to respond to this urgently. And those have kind of started to permeate across the market, from a regulatory perspective. And I'm thinking about the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, where there's kind of wholesale bans on goods coming in whole or in part from Xinjiang. You saw the apparel and the electronic sector respond to this. Now, in this case, more out of regulatory requirements than sort of true, kind of natural cause supply chain disruptions. But I think regardless of the actual industry in which this is happening, the common thread here is that these companies they view resilience as a competitive advantage and not a cost. The most proactive companies have realized that having a more secure and more resilient supply chain actually allows them to win more business. And I think to Jim's point, that can be true in the government as well, because it makes them more reliable partners. And that's true kind of in isolation, but it makes them more reliable than their competitors. Yeah, those are kind of the two sectors where we've seen it in the most. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's go to audience Q&A here. We got some good ones. I'll start with this one. How many years will it take for U.S. critical supply chains to unhitch themselves from dependence on risky suppliers? and how vulnerable is the U.S. National security ecosystem until that happens? We've answered some of that throughout the discussion, but curious on the first part, how many years will it take for U.S. supply chains?
Jim, do you want to venture a guess first?
Well, yeah, I think it's gonna be a while. How many years? Like I said, I'm old enough to remember when China was our friend, and China was going to be the great industrial manufacturing base for the world, and we would all reap the benefits of their labor rates and all those good things. And so here's the I don't know. I don't know the answer on how many years. Here's the way I would answer that question though. The conversation I've had with our operational leaders is you're they would get very excited when they'd see the chiclet charts that would say red risk, yellow risk, red risk. And you'd say, okay, there are going to be risks to our supply chains for years to come. The question is, so what? What are we going to do about it? It's not a question. It would be great if we got to a point where the supply chain was green, 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 all the way down the risk chart. I don't think that's realistic for the foreseeable future. The question is, what mitigation steps do we take in the interim to mitigate those risks? Do we have to put software patches on, as an add-on at the end? Do we have to um, limit the operational usage to training versus operations? All sorts of second order effects that have costs and burdens to themselves. But I think that's the reality of where we are for the foreseeable future.
And I think we're seeing the same thing where I can't agree with Jim more on that point where when we are now in a peer environment, risk is not going to go away. It's about how you respond to that risk and about whether or not you have the options available to pivot your supply chain or to look elsewhere when those risks become, frankly, untenable. And we've been working with a ton of government agencies on just this, where part one is understanding the nature of the risk that you face. And right, they've got these frameworks in place to assess that risk. And we're hearing like discussions are being had about, well, the risk is not zero, but it's low, and therefore we will operate in that environment knowing that there's low risk. But because there's low risk, we will also look at potential other suppliers or other vendors that could provide surge capacity if that risk ever reaches a point of being, frankly, too red or too hot. And this is, I think Jim touched a little bit about this when he was talking about, like no one wakes up with kind of perfect visibility of their supply chain. Like these things are dynamic, they're constantly changing. With that being the case, though, like it is absolutely crucial that whether you're in private sector or in government, that you have the data at your fingertips so that you can get sort of constant point in time visibility into your supply chain. Now, these things aren't static, right? Like trade activity is constantly happening, corporate ownerships change. Now, this isn't quite the Twitter fire hose where if you look away for a second, it's changed entirely. But it's really about striking a balance of kind of getting as near real-time visibility, sort of measured in days and weeks, so that again, when risk becomes too hot, you can kind of immediately look elsewhere. You've already mapped the supply chain, and you know that hey, there's these other companies that are very viable alternatives to the company that we've just determined is too hot for our supply chain.
So we have one audience member here who disagrees of whether we can get to a truly centralized or holistic supply chain approach, mostly because many, quote, acquisition officers and program teams don't know what an S1 or a Form D is. So curious, have B2B OSINT providers ever seriously focused on educational offerings to bridge this gap? And if not, why do you think that is?
Yeah, can I just start on that, David? Because I completely agree with that. Our acquisition workforce is constrained, right? There's a certain number of folks that the government's willing to pay for that do this stuff, and their skill sets and the training they go through, it does not include this today. It doesn't include the skill sets um, to really understand supply chain risk. When I think about how we train our acquisition logisticians, who you might argue, is the skill set within the government that is most aligned to this problem set. It's all about reliability, availability, maintainability. It's an assumption of a supply chain, and then and from a existent proficient supply chain, all their work goes forward from there. And that's a bad assumption. And I look at the skills, that David has. It's much more akin to the way we train our intel analysts to understand what questions to ask, to understand the second and third order effects, to understand the linkage diagrams that occur. It's very, very similar to the Intel products I've seen, and I think is what the questioner's point is. Um, I do think that there is value to a training, um, I, training the government on this. On the other hand, I think the user's question is, B2B, right? I'm sure most of our industry partners that are on this call would say the same thing. Hey, I don't have someone dedicated to be today with, maybe he's a former Intel analyst or she's a former Intel analyst and now could do this, use that same skill set on supply chains. I'm sure you're under the same constraints that you just don't have people today that have the DNA to do this. And so, yeah, I do think a training opportunity exists with this.
And one thing I'll add there is that, frankly, that training goes both ways. I think to the spirit of the question, this is an emerging requirement, and Jim kind of gave that story where like there's not always clear owners of these tasks. That shouldn't be interpreted to mean that there's not expertise in-house on the government side, because there definitely is. But there's also a different and complementary expertise in the private sector side. And I think where this really seems to work the best is, when private sector and government come together in partnership, transmitting best practices across each other, right? It makes, learnings from government to private sector make for better tools, make for better data collection. Going the other way, learnings from private sector to government might result in better screening practices or better spotting new types of emerging risk. But the most important thing is like that partnership has to go both ways.
Yeah. Okay. There's two more questions I want to get to here. So let's just say kind of a minute on each, just given our time constraint here. How do you go about those with bespoke service businesses? And this particular question says, I ask this genuinely because I get the overwhelming feeling the government is tired of B2B because they don't know what to do with it and need to buy services on data. And I can't read the rest, so I'll stop there. So going back to the question, how do you go about those with bespoke service businesses?
I can start with that. I mean, I'll admit I'm sort of speaking out of turn here. I don't work for a bespoke services company, but I think there's challenges there, and certainly our approach to the market is about creating data access in tools that minimize the need for that kind of sort of bespoke, I'll say, reliance on third parties. It's not to say that it disappears entirely, but we have a focus on rather than providing bespoke services, can we provide differentiated data and tooling that allows existing staff to deliver more faster and certainly in mission critical timelines.
Is there any agency or company working on a shared vetting process to share expenses across multiple users?
Good. So I'll just real quick. I think there was a nascent effort, and again, I can't speak for today, within the DoD to establish a database for this. But here's my concern again. as we've covered, kind of ad nauseum on this phone call, this is not static. And again, the analogy I would use is with our Intel community. If you put things into a database, you've got to date timestamp them, and you've got to understand when it occurred and how it occurred and why it occurred, because 2, 3 years later, the situation could be very different. However, that data over time should build again, I'm going to talk like an Intel analyst. It should build a pattern of life, a pattern of discovery that indicates, where good actors and bad actors and people that have, good hygiene in supply chain and folks that don't. I think that would be illuminating over time.
Okay, great. Sorry, Dave, do you want to?
Well, I was just going to say, I think these efforts are just starting. And it's I think we're seeing some of this with GSA scripts today, where there are attempts being made to build good tools and good solutions that aren't siloed. It's early days though, but I'm optimistic.
All right. Well, just to wrap here, we have a few minutes left. Just to your kind of conclusion on like what are the top takeaways for government folks and industry folks that are tuning in today?
Yeah. So I'm an eternal optimist. But I think the first one is, I would encourage you, as David said it, invest in supply chain risk, because it is a differentiator, and it will be as viewed as such. Be able to quantify your investment is number two. And then I think the third one is, it's not a one size fits all. Being able to scale your investment. And we haven't talked about this much, but again, with my special operations background, everything from classified programs to clandestine operations, there are some things that we consider the nation's, crown jewels, that we're going to make sure the supply chain risk on those crown jewels. Think nuclear triad, if you wanted just an example. Let's make sure our supply chain risk is zero on that. And then there's some things that maybe we're willing to accept more risk on, whether it's toilet seats or screwdrivers or what have you. But so be able to show that you've invested in it, be able to quantify that investment, and then for your own bottom line, scale that investment to where it really matters. Because for some acquisitions, we may not value supply chain risk knowledge as much as we would for others.
And I think what I would close with is, Jim's painted a couple examples of this today. We can't afford to be blind on this. And this is blindness not just to tier one, but also beyond suppliers. Like, the consequences are simply too catastrophic if you are. Second thing I would stress is, it's an echo of Jim's point, and that is, like, resilience is a competitive advantage, not just a cost. Sure, there is that initial investment in the early days, but it pays for itself by the pain that you avoid by having those diligence and supply chain mapping processes in place. And then the third thing I would stress is, the data is, if you've made the choice to get visibility into your supply chain, the data is there. Like, this is not a data access challenge. Again, that's not to say it's an easy challenge to fix, but the data is there, and like, start now, start small, but certainly start. Yeah. Thank you, Mo.
Great. Well, thank you, guys. If anyone wants to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to connect?
On the SARI side, check out our website, sari.com. There's some form fills. We'd love to talk to you about supply chain. Give us a ring.
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn as Jim Smith, and I'm a consultant at this point in my life, and so happy to connect with you on LinkedIn.
Well, thank you both for joining us today. Thank you to SARI for partnering on us on our first Tectonic webinar, and thanks to the guests and attendees for tuning in. So until next time, thanks everyone. Have a great day.